Some love begins with fireworks. This one started with steam, tender curls of it rising from a chipped mug on a rainy morning. In a small neighborhood cafe, a barista with a memory for names and a heart for quiet people meets a billionaire who has everything except rest. When their worlds touch over the hum of an espresso machine, each discovers the courage to slow down, listen closely, and let warmth climb softly, cup by cup. Nothing felt accidental then. Like, subscribe and share to keep these tender stories brewing. Your support helps us craft more love, hope, and comfort. The rain arrived, dressed for a long day, tapping on windows, brightening the worn wood floors of the Lark and Lantern with a silvery sheen. Theo had been in since dawn, humming without really thinking about it, the way he always did when the city's heartbeat was still stretching awake. He wore a navy apron, the same one that his grandmother had stitched a patch onto when he dropped a tray 3 years earlier. If you looked closely, you could see the patch was a little crooked. He loved it anyway. Some things were more tender because they weren't perfect. The bell over the door gave a mild ring like a quiet laugh. The regulars had their places. Mr. Harrison, retired schoolteacher, sat by the front with a paper that never changed no matter what the headlines were. Lucia, the florist from the corner shop, turned her tulip-colored umbrella upside down by the door and ordered a latte with cinnamon. A mother and her little boy shared a blueberry muffin and a whisper about dinosaurs. Theo's hands moved in a calm rhythm, cleaning, pouring, tamping, steaming, performing an affectionate dance he had never needed to rehearse. He liked this work. It was honest and full of small chances to care for people. Behind the counter, he was the sort of host who could read a shrug or a sigh, who could offer an extra napkin at the exact right moment, and who remembered that Mrs. Lee liked her Americano with a smile, which meant with a sugar packet and a brief slice of conversation about her dog. Theo had learned that the best part of coffee wasn't the caffeine. It was the invitation it gave people to be here, together, with something warm in their hands. At 8:15, precisely as the rain took a breath, a man stepped in, gray overcoat, umbrella in the other hand, a face that looked like it had been carved for profiles and boardroom portraits, and eyes that carried a quiet surprise at being somewhere he did not immediately recognize. He wasn't flashy. No watch brand showed itself. No ring of assistance followed. His hair, dark and slightly damp, curled by his neck. He took in the room like it was a story, and he wasn't sure if he was a character or a reader. "Good morning," Theo said, as he always did, the words unpretentious as bread. The man seemed grateful for the anchor. "Morning," he returned almost inaudibly, stepping closer to the counter with a careful, understated elegance. "What would you recommend for a day like this?" Theo liked that question. He always asked a question back. "How do you like to feel afterward?" he asked, hand poised near the espresso grinder. The man considered, which Theo appreciated. "Steady," he said, warmed. "Able to think again." "Cappuccino," Theo said, smiling. "A small one. Whole milk, if that's all right. Nothing sweet. It'll remind you you're here." "That sounds ideal," the man said, and something in his gaze softened. "Please." As the machine hissed and purred, Theo watched in the reflective stainless steel and saw the stranger glance around the cafe, letting his shoulders ease. Theo poured the milk slowly, letting the foam sit atop like a gentle sky. He carved a heart into it as a quiet habit, not flashy or exact, just a small offering. The man took the cup with both hands, and their fingers didn't touch, but the exchange felt complete and kind. He lifted the drink to his lips, tested the warmth, then took a careful sip. He exhaled in relief, like someone finally setting down a heavy bag they hadn't realized they were still carrying. "That is," he began, then smiled, the expression arriving as though it had been patiently waiting. "It is very good. I'm glad," Theo said. "I'm Theo." The man nodded once, almost shy. "Sebastian." Sebastian chose a small table near the window. He opened a leather-bound notebook, not a laptop, which Theo took as a sign, and balanced his pen at an angle that said he wrote clearly, if not always easily. He glanced up once, caught Theo's eye by accident, and gave a polite nod. Theo nodded back, then turned to the next order, but the exchange stayed with him like a warm echo. By the second day, Theo remembered that Sebastian had liked the small cappuccino and asked if he wanted the same. Sebastian looked surprised and pleased. On the third day, he arrived without the umbrella, the rain only a memory, but the cafe still his chosen place. He took to sitting at the same table by the window. The notebook appeared again. He wrote in little bursts, sometimes stopping to stare at the steam rising from the cup, as if the patterns held answers that needed to be coaxed out with patience. On the fourth morning, a Friday, Theo ventured further. "You feel like a cinnamon person," he said, adding a whisper of spice to the cappuccino before he could talk himself out of it. Sebastian took a sip, closed his eyes, and allowed the warmth to move through him. "You would be right," he said. "I didn't know that about myself. It's nice, finding new parts of yourself," Theo said matter-of-factly, unaware that he was already drawing the outline of something larger. Mr. Harrison watched from his usual paper, one eyebrow raised in the gentleman's version of mild mischief. Lucia smiled and told Theo to add a stem of eucalyptus to the vase by the register for a calm scent. The cafe breathed a little more deeply. Theo wiped the counter, placed cups to dry, and felt something like a tune come back to him from years ago, when he had almost forgotten he loved. A week later, Sebastian asked about the chalkboard sign by the door that read "Warm Nights Drive, New Socks, Gloves and Thermals for our neighbors on the street." There was a small basket, neat and confident. A few donations had begun to gather like shy birds. "That's yours?" he asked. "The whole neighborhood's," Theo said. "We do it every winter. Our block has been on this corner for a long time. People stop by. We try to make it easy to care." Sebastian nodded, as if someone had just said a true thing out loud. "It's the easiest things that are hardest to remember," he murmured. Theo leaned on the counter, only partly pretending he was adjusting the napkin holder. "What do you do?" he asked. Sebastian took a breath, then smiled in a way that was both careful and open. "I'm in business," he said, almost apologetically, as if he was the sort of person who fixed a broken sentence by retying it. "Important business?" Theo teased gently. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes it feels important. Sometimes it feels like a very expensive treadmill," Theo nodded. "Well, today you are in the business of drinking cappuccinos and staying dry," he said. "We can put that on the ledger, the ledger." The word hung between them like a joke they would revisit later, an inside nod in a world that often forgot to be inside anything together. They gathered moments the way the light gathered dust. When the morning rush ended, they would talk for a few minutes, about the weather, of course, then about the neighborhood stories Theo carried in his apron pockets, the way Mrs. Lee prayed for the stray cat, the way the postal carrier whistled a tune that sounded like rain. Sebastian listened like a man who had been thirsty for a very long time, and only now found that he was allowed to drink slowly. There were small details Theo noticed, as days stacked neatly into weeks. Sebastian's overcoat was always well-tailored, but never loud. He wore a navy scarf once that had been mended near the end, a perfect stitch that told a story about care more than about money. He usually left a generous tip, but folded it in half and slid it under the saucer, as if he were leaving a kindness under a stone for someone to find when they needed it. Theo told himself not to read too much into the way his chest felt lighter when Sebastian walked through the door. He had been a barista long enough to know that crushes on handsome strangers were as common as latte art hearts and usually evaporated just as easily. But this was different. This stayed. On a windy afternoon, Theo was cleaning the pastry case when Sebastian asked, "What is your favorite sound in here?" Theo straightened and pretended to consider, because he loved the question so much he needed to savor it. "The spoon," he said. "The soft clink it makes on the edge of a ceramic mug. It makes me feel like I'm home, even if I'm not," Sebastian nodded. "For me, it's the hiss right before the milk is ready. It sounds like a held breath finally letting itself go. Something lodged gently in Theo's throat. "You have a way with sentences," he said, laughing lightly to keep from revealing too much about how that sentence fit into his ribcage. "I write sometimes," Sebastian confessed. "Not for work, for myself." Theo had seen the notebook. He wanted to ask to read it, then felt that would be like asking to hold someone's old love letters. "That's good," he said. "Words are like bread. We should bake them at home, too." Their conversations turned from the edges of their days to the centers. Theo told Sebastian about his grandmother, who had passed when he was 25, and left him the recipe for her simple brown sugar cookies and the advice to never make coffee angry. He told him about the time he tried to play the piano, but found he only wanted to sit next to the instruments, as if they were people he could keep company with. He told him how he learned to change the espresso machine gaskets by watching a quiet video made by a kind man in Italy, Sebastian told Theo about a cabin he once visited in Vermont, where the night sky was so full of stars that he felt himself changing shape. He told him about reading poetry to no one at midnight in a hotel room because he liked the sound of someone speaking softly, even if it was only him. He told him about the smell of old books and the one time a street musician played Clair de Lune so delicately that he missed a meeting on purpose. Neither of them said what it meant that they were sharing these things. Neither of them needed to. One early evening, as the sun considered leaving and then decided to stay for one more look at the corner of the world, Sebastian lingered after his cup was empty. The cafe had thinned. Theo replaced the tip jar, swept the floor, set aside a bag of scones to deliver to the shelter at the end of the block. He glanced up. Sebastian was still there. "Do you ever close earlier?" Sebastian asked. "Only when the weather insists," Theo replied, smiling. "Or during the summer when the block party's band is too good to ignore." "Block party," Sebastian repeated, as if the words felt interesting on his tongue. "I haven't been to one of those in years." "You're overdue," Theo said, wiping the counter with a cloth that smelled of lemon and something else he could never quite name. Sebastian studied Theo for a long moment, and then seemed to decide something gentle and brave. "Could I take you to dinner?" he asked, his tone respectful and a little tentative, as if he understood that this was a question that sat in a place with candles around it. Theo felt the question land in his chest like a warm fruit dropped into waiting hands. He had always believed that the courage to ask was a kind of kindness. He also knew the cafe rule he'd set for himself: don't date customers. But Sebastian didn't feel like a customer anymore. He felt like someone who knew the exact weight of Theo's favorite mug. "Yes," Theo said. "I'd like that." They chose a Wednesday. Theo liked Wednesdays. They were honest and quiet and not trying to be too important. He closed the cafe at 6, left an extra bag of pastries at the shelter, and went home to change. He didn't have a closet full of suits. He had a sweater his grandmother had knit, a shirt with tiny blue checks that he loved, and a pair of leather boots that had lasted a decade and promised to keep lasting. He looked in the mirror and decided he looked like someone who could say what he meant. Sebastian arrived in a dark car, not a stretch of anything with a driver, but a sensible sedan. He drove himself. He stepped out in a charcoal coat and a scarf Theo had seen before, the one with the careful mend. He smiled when he saw Theo, the kind of smile that made the air more gentle. "Hi," he said, and there was a hint of relief to it, as if this moment was something he'd been asking the day for all along. "Hi," Theo said back, and the word felt sturdy. They went to a small place with a chalkboard menu, where the owner greeted Theo by name and placed 2 menus on the table and a sprig of rosemary on the plates, because she believed in good omens. They ordered simply roasted chicken, carrots, a salad with walnuts, and a carafe of water. They talked easily, the way certain rivers find each other if the land is willing. The din of the restaurant wrapped them in a safe, human blanket. Nearby, an older couple shared a tiramisu and leaned close to examine an old photograph on a phone. It felt like a good room to be in, "What made you start the warm night's drive?" Sebastian asked, tearing his bread thoughtfully. Theo sipped water, then set the glass down gently. "A man named Leonard used to come to the cafe," he said. He was quiet. He had a laugh that sounded like a wind chime on a small porch. "One winter he stopped coming. I worried, but I didn't know what to do. After that, I promised myself I'd put a basket out before the first cold snap. It's not everything, but it's something. It's a way to say, I will not look away." Sebastian nodded slowly. "You make this corner gentler," he said, and it sounded like an observation more than a compliment, which made it feel even more true. They spoke more, about things that weren't statistics or resumes. Theo had been to Paris once in a painting because his grandmother kept a framed print of a rainy street by a bridge, and he would stand in front of it and listen for footsteps. Sebastian had been to Paris in person 3 times, but when he described it, the smell of butter, the suddenness of the river turning like a person deciding to laugh, Theo realized they were talking about the same place. At the end of the meal, they did not hurry. They walked down the block afterward and paused by the window of the Lark and Lantern. The lights were off, and yet the inside held the memory of people and mornings and muffins and the small drama of steam. Sebastian's breath made a fog on the glass, and he drew a tiny cup with his finger and then wiped it away immediately, embarrassed. Theo found it unspeakably dear. "It looks good right there," he said, and touched his own finger to the fog and drew a tiny heart next to the cup, then felt a little silly and let himself feel that exactly as much as it deserved to be felt, a small, sweet, silly, like sugar on the tongue. Sebastian turned to him and said very gently, "I'd like to see you again." "So would I," Theo replied. They did. The next week they walked by the river and watched the gulls argue with the sky. They stopped in at a tiny used bookshop where the owner let them take turns reading a poem to her cat. They made soup together once, in Theo's modest kitchen, and laughed when they realized they had both tried to salt it and made it too ambitious. They ate it anyway, each pretending it was exactly right, because it was right in the way that being together made the soup not the point of the evening. Theo had never had patience for pretense. He was 31 and had been through one love that had broken up with him kindly but decisively years ago, and he had arrived at a place where he wanted to say things clearly and gently. He found that Sebastian welcomed this, but Theo also had questions he didn't ask. There were clues. Sebastian's phone, which never rang during their walks but hummed silently and was sometimes answered in the other room. The way sometimes, when they said goodbye, a car that wasn't a taxi was waiting at the corner for him. The way he spoke about work, obliquely, and with a practiced art of making important things seem ordinary. Theo had never been much for Googling people he cared about. He didn't want to bring the noisy outside into the quiet they were building, but he also wasn't naive. Sebastian was good at being careful. He suspected there was more to his job than a business card. This quiet question found its way to air on a crisp afternoon when they sat on a bench by the community garden. The strawberries had gone, but the rosemary and sage were tender and brave in the wind. Theo held a cup of chamomile, which Sebastian had brought from a thermos, and Sebastian looked like a man deciding how to fold a truth so that it would fit through a doorway. "I've been wanting to tell you," he began, watching his breath fog on the air. "I didn't want it to be the first thing, because it never feels like the first thing inside me. But the world often insists on it being the first thing about me in a room." Theo turned to him, his posture unworried and attentive. "I'm here," he said. "I run a company," Sebastian said with careful understatement. "Vale & Co." He paused. The name carried the kind of weight that familiarizes itself with newspaper ink. "We build and invest. Real estate mostly. Tech sometimes. A portfolio of risk," he added, as if he were trying to reach for smaller words to make the larger ones behave. "People like to use the word billionaire. I try not to use it myself because it sounds loud. But that is, in the strict accounting sense, the truth." Theo's mind did a quick, surprised little skip, then steadied. He took a breath, felt the bench beneath him, the chamomile warmth, the rosemary nodding like an old friend nearby. He looked at the man next to him, who he knew liked the sound of a spoon against a mug. The labels rearranged themselves politely to make space. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Are you okay?" Sebastian laughed once, softly, relieved. "That's what you ask." Theo smiled back. "It seems important," he said. "If it makes everything too loud for you sometimes, I'd like to know how to help make it quieter. And if it makes things complicated, like if people might make assumptions about me because I'm next to you, then I'd like to know we can talk about those things, like grown-ups who care about each other." Sebastian let out a breath he had been holding for years. "Yes," he said, his eyes bright. "Yes, thank you. That means more than I can say without sounding sentimental." "Sentimental is allowed," Theo said. "We'll just salt it carefully." They laughed, and the laughter felt like something old and well-made. Theo didn't ask to Google him then. He didn't need to. He could see that Sebastian had told this truth with the same care he ordered coffee. Of course, the world eventually noticed. It happened on a Tuesday when a local blogger, excited about the Warm Nights Drive and the way donations were pouring in, posted a sweet write-up about the Lark and Lantern's efforts. It included a photo taken by Lucia the florist, a generous shot of the basket overflowing with socks and hats and notes of encouragement. In the corner of the photo, framed by a window and a string of paper snowflakes, was Theo laughing as Sebastian handed him a stack of folded scarves. Within a day, someone in the city's business gossip circle reposted it with a set of gleeful questions. "Is that Sebastian Vale? Which cafe is that? Is the Ice King warming up?" The comments multiplied like yeast in a warm bowl. Some were kind. Some were curious. Some were sharp-edged. Theo felt the sudden attention like cold air under a door. The next day, a small Mercedes he didn't recognize idled across the street. A person with a very expensive camera pretended to take pictures of the brickwork and then took pictures of the door instead. Theo saw them through the glass and felt a small wave of nausea unspool. He dried his hands harder than necessary, then set down the towel and looked up just as the door opened and Sebastian stepped in. Sebastian took in the scene quickly. He had walked into fires before. His shoulders know how to bend around danger and protect the room. He moved to the counter and set a cardboard box on it. "I brought gloves," he said, louder than he needed to, making sure the sentence landed. "And those thermals you said were best. I found the exact ones." Theo met his eyes, and in a swift flicker told him 1,000 anxious things, and asked for one simple thing. "Help me make this still be what it is." Sebastian's gaze steadied. "2 small cappuccinos," he added, turning to the menu as if he had never thought of ordering anything else. He took his cup, turned to the camera in the street, and faced it like a man who had decided not to be ashamed of being warm. The camera person, sensing there would be no chaos here, no stumble, no scandal, took a few awkward steps back, and then left with a muttered apology about the weather. The cafe exhaled. Mrs. Lee clapped quietly. Mr. Harrison, who had taught generations to read without making them feel small, smiled into his newspaper. Lucia fetched a bouquet of eucalyptus for the counter because some rituals are practical magic. Sebastian leaned in and spoke low to Theo. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't want the noise to come to your door," Theo nodded. "I know," he said. "We'll tide it through like we do with all weather. It helps that you can carry boxes. That gives people something practical to point at." He teased gently. They created rhythms to keep the world soft. Sebastian learned to use the side entrance when the front felt too observed, but he didn't hide. Theo placed a bell on the door that made a slightly different chime, just for his own private smile when it rang. They coordinated with Lucia to host the Warm Nights Drive in her flower shop when the cafe grew too busy, and the neighborhood learned to drop things off in both places, because kindness likes having multiple doors. In quiet moments, when the cafe faded into late afternoon and the sunlight stretched on the floor like a cat, they would stand in the kitchen and talk. No secrets, only rooms of honesty where they could set down their thoughts and know they'd still be there untouched when they returned. Theo told Sebastian about his fear of being nothing more than a charming footnote in another man's story. And Sebastian told Theo about his fear of letting his life be a staircase of obligations he climbed without ever looking out the window. "What do you see when you look ahead?" Theo asked once, stirring sugar into his tea. "A porch," Sebastian answered without hesitation. Not a metaphorical one, an actual porch, with 2 chairs and a little table, the kind of place where the mornings know your name, where neighbors don't feel like a concept. Theo felt the answer settle over him like a blanket. "I know the porch," he said softly. "I've been waiting there." Sebastian had his own complicated weave of threads to manage. Vale & Co. was a constellation of properties and people. He had built it in part to create spaces he wished had existed when he was younger. Honest housing, well-kept public areas, buildings that were made to outlast the mood of a quarter. But he had also inherited pieces of the empire from his father, who had not always been gentle, and from partners who believed that the bottom line was a god that rewarded sacrifices. He was used to negotiating. He was not used to having something so human at the center of his day that the charts and forecasts had to slide politely to the side. The tension came into focus when Theo mentioned, casually, while drying a cup, that a letter had come from a new management company regarding the building's lease. The landlord apparently had sold the property to a holding group, and they wanted to explore options that included renovations and market rate alignment. Theo said the words without panic. He was used to change, but his fingers stilled on the dish towel and his shoulders lifted very slightly, like someone bracing for a wind they could not stop. "May I see the letter?" Sebastian asked, and his voice had shifted into a kind of quiet that was not anger, but close to it, a protective weather. Theo hesitated, then handed it over. Sebastian read it once, the way someone might read a menu, then again the way someone reads a warning sign on a road they know well. "The holding group is ours," he said softly, jaw working. "Through a subsidiary. I didn't realize this was one of the properties." He lifted his eyes to Theo's, and guilt bloomed there like a bruise. "I'm sorry," Theo breathed. He folded the dish towel neatly. He set it down. He considered all the ways he could react. He looked at the man in front of him, who had stocked a basket with gloves, and learned the sound of the spoon on the mug, and drawn a tiny cup in fog on a window. He felt the fear rise to his throat that he would lose this place, and with it the day he had built brick by warm brick. Then he recognized the truth of the man in front of him, not the company. "Let's talk about it," he said. Sebastian nodded once, thankful. He made 2 calls. His voice stayed calm, but there was steel beneath it that Theo hadn't heard before, not like this. He said words like pause and hold, and "I want to see the files, and we will not proceed in any manner that jeopardizes community anchors." He hung up, looked at Theo, and said, with a tone that settled in Theo's bones, "I will not let them take this from you. I will not let them take it from the neighborhood. Not because of us, not because of me. I'm not a charity," Theo said gently. "And I won't be your project." "I know," Sebastian returned, equally gentle. "This will not be charity. This will be stewardship. And I want to make sure that what we do would be right even if you and I were strangers. We will do this as if we were strangers. Then we will go for a walk and hold hands like we are not." Theo smiled despite himself. "I like the way you think." They met with the building's tenants. They sat in a circle in the cafe after hours, with paper cups of tea and the hum of the refrigerator as the only witness. Mrs. Lee brought cookies. Lucia brought eucalyptus because it helps people tell the truth. Mr. Harrison took notes because he'd never learned how not to be a teacher. They talked about the need for repairs, the paint that needed touching, the plumbing that complained, the back stairway that had a mind of its own. They talked about rent and fear, and the way the city had been leaning on their street with a weight it could not keep choosing without breaking something essential. Sebastian listened. He said he didn't know everything because he didn't. He explained what could be done, what could not. He did not make unkeepable promises. He used his position and power like a careful tool, not a weapon. He asked the group to vote on whether they wanted him to purchase the building directly and place it under a community-first trust with limits on rent increases, permanent protections for the cafe and the flower shop, and a commitment to regular, respectful maintenance. He suggested they create a small tenants' council to hold him accountable. He instructed his lawyers to draft the documents in plain language and to include both an exit clause and a dignity clause, words he used because they were clear in his mind, the latter ensuring that any future sale would have to follow the same humane rules. It took weeks, not days. Theo learned how to sleep with questions curling like cats at the end of the bed. Sebastian learned the names of the children upstairs and the dog on the second floor who barked at passing trucks but always wagged at Lucia. The press tried to make a story out of it. Billionaire saves beloved cafe. Theo refused interviews. He said, "Come by and have a scone to every request," and made the scones slightly warmer than usual. The papers were signed on a bright morning that smelled faintly of cinnamon and ink. The tenants gathered again. It felt less like a transaction and more like a small vow everyone made to one another out loud. After, the neighborhood decided what it knew best to do when something lovely needed celebrating. It planned a party. Lucia hung lights across the street, tiny lanterns that made the block look like it was remembering how to glow. Someone set up a speaker and a playlist that accidentally included both Motown and a sprinkling of Debussy, because Mr. Harrison liked to move between eras. The flower shop placed stems in jars on tables, and the cafe made trays of sandwiches and bowls of strawberries, because strawberries always make people smile. Children drew chalk hearts on the pavement and ran in loops, trailing laughter. Theo wore the blue-checked shirt. Sebastian wore a sweater and looked like a man who was learning how to show joy in public. They stood side by side at a folding table and poured lemonade and spoke to everyone as if they were neighbors, because they were. There were speeches, of course. There are always speeches when people who are usually unseen get asked to be visible on purpose. Mr. Harrison gave one. Lucia said a few words and made even the eucalyptus look proud. At some point, a song played that no one could resist. The older couple from the restaurant arrived, inexplicably, but perfectly, because it turned out they lived around the corner. They danced together, and everyone made room for them without needing to be asked. Theo looked at Sebastian, felt the moment gather itself, and reached for his hand. Sebastian took it as if that had always been the ending of every sentence he said in this place. They didn't dance right away. They stood and watched the others. Sebastian leaned in and said near Theo's ear, "I found the porch." Theo smiled. "So did I." He squeezed his hand, the same way he pressed the tamp with the perfect pressure he had practiced for years. "We'll put 2 chairs, maybe 3, for when Mr. Harrison arrives with his newspaper." Sebastian laughed, and the sound settled in the lanterns overhead. "And a small table," he added. "4 cups." "Cups are important," Theo agreed solemnly. They danced then. Not elegantly, not as people who needed to prove anything, but as 2 men in a street under lights who had chosen to be seen. The music slowed for a minute, then brightened, then softened again. Theo leaned his head against Sebastian's shoulder and allowed his worries to leave for the night. He could pick them up tomorrow, but for now, the road was swept clean. Later, when the string lights had learned the names of the stars and the last of the lemonade had been poured, and the little boy who loved dinosaurs had been carried home, Theo and Sebastian walked down the block quietly. They stopped in front of the cafe and looked at it as if it were a person they loved, who had made it through something difficult with grace. "May I kiss you?" Sebastian asked, and it made Theo's heart ache in the best way. The way that people ask permission because they think you are a poem and they want to read you with respect. "Yes," Theo said, steady and clear. The kiss was not a spectacle. It was a soft, grateful closing of a circle that had begun with a cappuccino on a rainy morning. It tasted faintly of lemon and cinnamon and something like a promise without words. The bell on the door chimed the breeze's applause. If you asked them later, Theo would say that love, for him, had been like learning that the perfect pour requires not just skill, but presence, and that being present required forgiving himself for all the days he forgot to be. Sebastian would say that love, for him, had been like taking off a coat he'd forgotten he had on indoors and realizing that the air was gentle enough to be felt. Winter turned with its deliberate dignity into spring. The warm night's basket returned to Lucia's shop as a basket of postcards for people to write to residents at the senior home down the street. Theo began a Saturday morning hour where he read poems out loud to anyone who wanted to listen while the first scones were cooling. Sebastian attended without fail, sitting near the back and looking like a man who was learning how to be someone else's audience. He brought his notebook and sometimes jotted down a line to keep in his pocket like a pebble. They made a habit of walking on Sundays. They experimented with soups. They had arguments that were small and specific and kind. Once they fought about whether to repaint the cafe chairs or leave their scuffs as a story. Theo wanted to sand them and give them a new shine. Sebastian wanted to keep the wear. They laughed when they realized they were arguing about the future and the past at the same time, and decided, as they often did, to let the present suggest an answer. They fixed the wobbly ones and left the scars on the others to remind themselves that love is not the same thing as perfection. Sebastian introduced Theo to his world slowly, not because he was ashamed, but because he wanted to weave it gently into the life they were building, like a thread of gold through a sturdy cloth. He brought him to a dinner once, the kind with place cards and centerpieces and speeches from people who received more applause than they received honesty. Theo watched him navigate a room that had learned how to orbit him. He saw the kindness in the way Sebastian listened to the two waiters discussing their classes in whispers and left them a tip that was both generous and respectful, accompanied by a note that said, "Thank you for carrying so much." He heard him tell an investor, with a calm, firm voice, that no, they would not demolish a building for a profit, because a city was not a game board. On the way home, in the quiet of the car, Theo reached for his hand, and they drove without talking for a while, the kind of silence that holds. Theo also brought Sebastian into his soft world. He taught him the names of the regulars, and the way Mr. Harrison could be coaxed into telling a story about his first year teaching if you asked him about the chalk dust on his sleeves. He taught him that the espresso machine didn't like to be rushed, and that the cat at the shelter preferred to be scratched just between his shoulder blades. He taught him that sometimes the best thing to say to someone who is crying is nothing at all. Instead, hand them a cup and stand with them until the storm passes. One afternoon, when the sky was the precise color of a robin's egg and the air smelled somehow of clean laundry, Sebastian found Theo setting up a tiny planter box outside the cafe. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Thyme and marigolds," Theo said. "I like that they are useful and beautiful and don't apologize for being both." "Like you," Sebastian said, with a softness that made Theo look up and meet his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them needed to fill the air with anything but the fact of their willingness to be seen. Not everything was simple. They met one week with a group of angry voices in suits and a woman in a blue dress with a pen that bullied the paper it touched. They threatened lawsuits. They did not come from the neighborhood. They did not see a cafe. They saw a line item. Sebastian's back straightened. Theo felt the old fear stir, then felt just as quickly the newer courage he'd been growing, like the time. They walked out together and went to the river and stood there and allowed themselves the grace of grieving what they could not control. Then they turned back and continued to do what they could control, be kind in public and fierce in private, and told the line with the quiet power of people who know that their love is part of the neighborhood too. On a late summer evening, a postcard arrived in Theo's mailbox from a resident at the senior home addressed to the coffee man and the nice gentleman with the pretty scarf. It read, "Thank you for reading to us. You make Wednesdays softer. P.S. Love is not just for the young. We were young once, and we still like roses. Theo taped it to the fridge and showed Sebastian, who held it as if it were a relic and brushed the corner with his thumb. I want to be good at this, Sebastian said once, his voice low and honest, when they sat on Theo's couch with the windows open and the city breathing in and out. All of it. Not performatively good, quietly good. The kind you can taste in the coffee. You are, Theo said simply. You're learning how to take the coat off at the door. Sebastian laughed softly, his forehead resting against Theo's temple. I had no idea I was wearing it for so long. You are not the only one, Theo said. I used to think I had to do everything alone. That asking for help was a failure of character. And now I know it's a recipe, Theo said. It's how we make the soup. They didn't rush to talk about marriage. They didn't rush anything that didn't need rushing. They made plans for the fall, reading nights, a fundraiser for the shelter that involved Lucia's flowers, and Mr. Harrison's former students offering to play in a quartet. They painted 2 chairs a gentle blue and placed them on a borrowed porch belonging to the apartment upstairs, while they waited with patience and humor for a porch of their own, and on a morning that the air felt like new paper, and the sun came in the window the way good news comes in a letter with a stamp. Theo opened the cafe and set the day upon the counter, cups, lids, napkins, hope. He looked at the door. He looked at the corner where the eucalyptus usually stood. He heard the bell ring, the sound like a small, bright promise. Sebastian came in, hair a little tousled from the breeze. He wore no scarf, no coat, just a simple sweater and a look that Theo had learned to know very well. He carried a small, flat box. Before the rush, he said, smiling, voice slightly breathless. If you have 2 minutes. For you, 5, Theo said, reaching for the box with a combination of excitement and a joke rehearsed only for him. Sebastian set it on the counter and opened it. Inside, on a soft bed of tissue, were 2 keys on a single string. The keys had tiny brass tags. One read porch, the other read home. What did you do? Theo asked, his hand hovering as if the keys were a bird that might startle. Nothing dramatic, Sebastian said, because he had learned to be careful with drama. A small house up the hill, the kind with a porch that has already met 1,000 mornings. The kind that looks good in rain. It felt like a place we could put our chairs. Theo felt his eyes warm. He breathed to steady them. Sebastian, he said quietly, the whole story held in the name. I'm not asking anything too big right now, Sebastian added quickly. Just, will you come see it with me tonight? And if you like it, will you help me hang wind chimes that sound like kindness? We can take our time. We can make it ours slowly, the way we do everything with patience, like coffee. Theo took the keys. They were the exact weight he could hold. He leaned over the counter, took Sebastian's face in his hands, and kissed his forehead, the way his grandmother had taught him to bless someone without needing a church. Yes, he said, his voice steady and sure. Yes, let's go look at our porch. They did. And when they stood on the porch at dusk, holding 2 enamel mugs that had lived 3 owners before them, the city stretching below like an open book, they knew that love does not need to knock loudly to be heard. Sometimes it inches its way into the room with the steam from a cappuccino, finds a chair, and sits down as if it has always been welcome. Not every morning would be easy. Some would spill, some would burn, some would bring letters with difficult words and cameras with unasked questions. But there would be a bell over the door, a spoon on a mug, a basket at the ready, and a world of neighbors who understood that being together is a choice we make on purpose. And at the center of it, there would be 2 men who had learned to warm their days with simple rituals, a hand held in public, a vow written in plain language, a kiss that didn't need to perform for any room but the one they were in. In the years to come, when the marigolds grew sturdy, and the time took over the corner with more confidence than anyone expected, when Mr. Harrison retired from retirement to volunteer at the library, When Lucia's eucalyptus became the scent by which people would later remember this chapter of their lives, people would tell the story of the barista and the billionaire with fondness. They would say, "Do you remember how the basket overflowed? Remember the lights? Remember the night we danced in the street and the air felt like forgiveness?" And someone would add, "Remember how he said, 'I found the porch'?" And someone else would answer, "Yes, yes, I do." And the bell would ring, the door would open, and the day would begin again, with steam rising from a cup, patient and kind, as if nothing had ever been accidental.